So today we're going to take a look at Module 4. And in Module 4, they're going to discuss the business cycle. We'll take a look at that here in a second. We're also going to take a look at the government regulations, shortages and surpluses, monopolies, the Federal Reserve, and fiscal policy, and the tools of the Fed. All right, so let's just dive right into it here. So before we jump into the business cycle, we need to make sure that we understand and remember what GDP is. Remember, gross domestic product are all the final goods and services produced in a nation in a year. It's all the stuff the economy is making. If we have less goods and services being produced, then we're going to need less workers. With a lower GDP, this is going to yield or lead to a higher rate of unemployment. Unemployment's really bad. In a recession, you're going to see that we're making less stuff because in a recession, there's lots of people not working. There's lots of capital. Remember capital, those tools and equipment? There's lots of capital. There's lots of factories not being fully utilized. In a recession, there's a lot of capitals and machines that are shut down. A lot of people not working. So GDP is going to be low. The business cycle begins to track GDP output over a period of time. The economy is either growing or expanding along this green portion. If we have this expansion or growth of the economy, we're making more GDP. During expansionary periods, you're going to see that GDP is going up and therefore unemployment is going down. Typically when this occurs, you're going to see that price levels go up at the same time. When price levels go up over time, this is known as inflation. During a contractionary period, also known as a recession, this is when the economy is beginning to shrink. We're seeing GDP actually declining. During the recession, because GDP is going down and we're making less goods and services, unemployment is actually going to rise. During this time period, you're typically going to see price levels decline. When you're at the very top here, this is known as the peak. At the bottom is known as the trough. The government doesn't want to see the economy stay at a trough for too long, so they're going to want to try and grow or expand the economy. They have options. The federal government has the ability to manipulate government spending and taxes. This is known as fiscal policy. If the economy is in a recession because there's not enough spending going on, then the federal government can enact what is known as expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy, again, are the two tools that the government has at its disposal to influence spending. They can either increase government spending or they could lower taxes. If they lower your taxes, you have more money in your pocket. If you have more money in your pocket, then households will go out and consume more. Let's take a look at the problem here. If the economy is in a recession, one possible solution could be the idea of expansionary fiscal policy, where the government increases its spending and or decreases taxes. When this occurs, you're going to see that there's more spending in the economy. Down here is an aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. We see that the long-run aggregate supply line represents the potential output of our economy. We're trying to reach this potential output down here. We're trying to reach this level of output. But right now, we're not quite there. The intersection of supply and demand leaves us with an output level, a real GDP output level, that's a little less. If we increase government spending or decrease taxes, which will then increase consumer spending, there will be more spending in the economy. Aggregate demand is really just the spending in the economy. It's all the government spending plus the household spending plus the business spending on capital and foreign spending on imports and exports. If we have more government spending or lowering of taxes, then we're going to see an increase of aggregate demand. And aggregate demand increasing is a shift to the right. So all of a sudden, this rightward shift or increase of AD will now have us producing at a higher level of output. GDP is now going to go up. However, there's a trade-off. You're going to see that now price levels are higher. If there's more demand for goods and services, the price of those goods and services will go up. So inflation will occur. Remember, inflation is when prices rise over time. That's not the only trade-off we have. The government is now spending more money than is bringing in tax revenue. If you spend more than you bring in, you're going to go into a deficit. A budget deficit occurs when government spending is greater than tax revenue. This is going to cause a budget deficit, which will add to our national debt. If the economy is experiencing a budget deficit, they're going to have to borrow this money. Borrowing money is not free. The more money you borrow, the more you're going to have to pay. The cost of borrowing money is interest. When the government continues to have more and more budget deficits, this will raise interest rates, which is not good because then it slowly makes people not want to borrow and spend in the economy. The goals or benefits of the expansionary fiscal policy was we were able to increase GDP and therefore drop unemployment. But remember, our trade-offs are the inflation that's going up, those price levels rising. Now we have a larger budget deficit or an increase in our national debt. And also, you're going to see a slight increase in interest rates, which could stop spending in the future. If we had the problem of inflation, it would simply be the exact opposite. If we wanted to have a contractionary fiscal policy because of this problem of inflation, we would follow these lines here. Problem of inflation, the solution would be what's known as a contractionary fiscal policy, where you decrease government spending and increase taxes. This would lead to that budget surplus. It would also lead to lower levels of inflation and a higher level of unemployment. The Federal Reserve main goal is to control the money supply and try and maintain stable prices and low levels of unemployment. The Federal Reserve controls the money supply through what is known as monetary policy. The goal of the Federal Reserve is to have approximately a 2% rate of inflation each year. Nice, low, steady, and predictable. We also want to maintain a nice low level of unemployment, approximately 4% today. This isn't zero. We would have naturally occurring types of unemployment, such as frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. We can talk about those later. Remember, interest is the cost of borrowing money. The more money in the money supply, the more money that's out there, the less it should cost to borrow that money. With more borrowing, you're going to get more spending, which will increase that aggregate demand and should grow our economy. Remember, we're trying to get ourselves out of this recession. We're trying to increase aggregate demand. Well, the Federal Reserve, also known as the banker's bank, has the ability to manipulate how much money is out there in our supply of money. We have a finite amount of money out there. The Federal Reserve has the ability to increase the amount of money out there or decrease the amount of money out there. If we have a problem of a recession where our current level of output, of GDP output, is less than the potential level of output. The YF, this vertical LRIS line, that is our potential level of output. If we wanted to increase spending, the Federal Reserve could conduct what is known as expansionary monetary policy. If they were to have expansionary monetary policy, which are either buying bonds in the open market, lowering the discount rate, or lowering the reserve requirement, any of those three things would cause the supply of money to increase. When the supply of money increases, there's now more money out there and available, so it should now cost less to get that money. So interest rates are now lower. When interest rates are lower, it's now cheaper to borrow money. So what do households and businesses do? Households and businesses borrow more money and they go and spend. With an increase of spending, increasing of demanding of goods and services in an economy, you're going to see that aggregate demand increases because of that increase in consumer spending and increase in business spending on capital. When this occurs, you'll see that price levels increase, so therefore inflation increases. You'll also see that output increases, GDP. So when GDP increases, we need more workers, so unemployment declines. Buying bonds in the open market will increase the money supply. Lowering the discount rate, which are just simply interest rates that the Federal Reserve loans to other banks, or if the Federal Reserve lowers the reserve requirement. The reserve requirement is how much banks have to hold on to money. They're able, if the reserve requirement is lowered, banks are able to lend out more money in the money supply to people so that they can borrow it. If the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates to banks, banks can then lower the interest rate on loans to people and businesses. If the Federal Reserve buys bonds from the public, that means the Federal Reserve is going to take money out of their bank vaults and give it to the public, making the money supply larger, thus lowering interest rates. If we were to see a problem of inflation, then the Federal Reserve may want to tighten the money supply or shrink it. What's up? That's tight. Maybe you guys have heard someone say that. What's up, man? Oh, yeah, that's tight. What's up? That's tight. Sup tight. Sup tight is a mnemonic device that one of my students came up with about a decade ago. Sup is sell bonds, up the discount rate, and up the reserve requirement. If you sell up, that's going to be a version of tight money policy. Tight money is a contraction of the money supply. It shrinks the money supply. When you shrink the money supply, or when something becomes more rare, it should cost more to get it. It's now more expensive to get money. So therefore, interest rates have increased. When interest rates increase and it costs more to get money, there will be less spending. With less spending, this would lead to a decrease in aggregate demand and shrink the economy. It would take us out of that inflationary period. Remember, when the government spends money, there's an opportunity cost. We do not have an infinite amount of money. Money that the government spends on clean water can't be used on clean air. There's an opportunity cost. If we simply print more money and we have that expansionary monetary policy here, increasing the money supply, there is also another trade-off. By printing more money and having more money in the money supply, the money we have will lose its value. Inflation causes money to lose value over time. Just think of current economies such as Venezuela or Zimbabwe. You can have hundreds and hundreds of dollars in the current Venezuelan bolivar, but that won't be able to buy you breakfast. There are options that are positive. If we invest in more capital for businesses, remember, capital are the tools and equipment that's used to create more goods and services. Or if the government were to spend that money on infrastructure are things like roads, bridges, telecommunications, power lines, utilities. If we spent more money on the infrastructure and capital, then the economy would be able to produce more in the future. This is known as economic growth. As illustrated in our example last unit, I think we had pizza and pasta. If the economy put all of its resources into the production of these items, they could only produce along this curve. But if this economy were to have more tools and equipment, more capital, then they would be able to produce more in the future because of the advancements in technology, because of the greater amount of infrastructure, because of the additional machines. This unit also discusses the idea of surpluses and shortages. This goes back to our first unit. Remember, equilibrium is going to be the intersection between supply and demand. In this example here, we have the price of stocks and the quantity of stocks. At a price of $5, there's going to be a supply of 100 units and a demand of 100 units. But if the price is actually above the equilibrium, then you're going to, that quantity being demanded is lower. With higher prices, people don't want to buy as much. But a high price is a signal to the supplier to allocate more resources towards the production of that item. They think that they can make more money, so they'll produce more of it. The supply will actually be 140, where the demand is only 50 when the price is set at $7. When demand is greater than supply, you have a surplus. In this case, a surplus of 90. When demand is greater than supply, you will have a shortage. In this case, when the price is below the equilibrium, we have a shortage of 170 units. 30 are being created and only 200 are being provided. We also go ahead and discuss in this section the idea of government regulations and monopolies. The government has the ability to set regulations for businesses, making it more difficult for them to produce items. If this occurs, you could see that the supply will be changed. Let me give you an example of what this might look like. If you have the average demand of the economy as such, and the average supply here, you have your price level and you have your real GDP. Remember, aggregate supply is inverse to cost of production. If the government adds additional regulations, it's going to make it more expensive to produce things. If it's more expensive to produce things, businesses will produce less, and aggregate supply will decrease. When you have a decrease in aggregate supply, two things occur. You're going to see that the output level and price levels change. When you supply less, there's going to be less output being created. When you supply less and there's less available, things become more rare and they become more expensive. This is an example of an increase of government regulations. If the economy if the government was providing government subsidies and we're actually giving money to businesses, as in AS3, By providing government subsidies, you'd actually make it cheaper for businesses to produce. In that case, they would produce more. And when you produce more and things become less rare, prices will actually decline. That should be the conclusion here of Module 4. We discussed the ideas behind your fiscal policy, which is government spending and taxes, monetary policy, which is the manipulation of the money supply through monetary policy, of buying and selling bonds, increase or decreasing their discount rate, or increasing or decreasing the reserve requirement. We also discussed the opportunity costs associated, or the trade-offs. When you increase demand, unemployment drops, but you see inflation increases. We also have a structure of the Federal Reserve that's broken up by the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the group which decides whether or not they should buy or sell bonds to influence the interest rates. The Federal Reserve banks, there are 12 of them in total, which are considered to be the bankers' banks, which helps discuss whether or not the discount rate should be increased or decreased. And lastly, you have all the member banks, which are going to have the reserve requirements placed upon them. These are the banks that will lend out to you, like Bank of America, for example. If Bank of America is required to hold on to a large portion of deposits, they're not able to lend out to you, so the money supply would be decreased. I hope this helps, and I hope you guys learned something. Take care.